Well, thank you all for coming. On behalf of the Ho Center for Buddhist Studies and Continuing Studies at Stanford, it's my great pleasure and my honor to introduce today's speaker. Today's lecture is part of the TT and WF Chao Buddhist Art Series. So please join me in welcoming Professor Lo Tan-Ing.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. I will just start by asking you a simple question, I think, simple. Who knows this painting? Does anybody know that painting? Yes. Sure. Excellent. Yes, thank you. And do you know roughly the title or the? No, I don't want to do exams. It's called the Four Disciples, whatever they are, Four Disciples of Christ, and so this painting was given by Dürer in 1526 to his hometown Nuremberg, and he died 2 years later in 1528. Now we have another nice painting here. Does anybody know that one? Yes. 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 So this is Dung Chi Chang's painting called Wan Lon Cao Tang Tu, painted in the 10th month of 1597 for his friend Chen Ji-ru, and Dung Chi Chang died in 1636. Now, what are the differences between what are the difference between the two paintings? I mean, I don't want to make a seminar, but I mean, of course, one is painted on wood, one is painted on paper. This is oil, color. This is only ink, and this hangs on the wall. You cannot roll it up. This one you can roll up and put it in a box, and then it's gone. I mean, don't see it any longer. But the most crucial difference to me is that this painting has colophons. It is not in the state when it was in when it left the hand of the artist. This painting looked like that in 1528 when Dürer gave it to his patrons, to the city of Nuremberg. This painting looked very different from now, what it looks now in 1597 when Dung Chi Chang finished it. I mean, Dung Chi Chang had just written the title here, the title Wan Lon Cao Tang Tu, and then later maybe another small colophon. So, but then in the 18th century, the Qianlong Emperor wrote all over. He wrote all these things, and he even wrote on the mounting. I mean, he couldn't stop himself. So he even wrote on the mounting and put on all these seals, and so we call, I mean, you cannot see the painting in the original state any longer. You don't know, or you cannot see, you cannot look at it as it was in the state when it left the hand of the painter Dung Chi Chang, because of all those colophons. Now the word colophon is a difficult word. I just use a simple definition. Colophon, I call anything in a broad sense what has been written after a particular work was finished. Be it a calligraphy or painting, anything which was added, a secondary writing to the original work. This I just call colophon. And the colophons mostly were written by somebody else. Sometimes also the artist himself, in an afterthought, wrote something, but mostly the colophons were written not by the primary maker, but by a secondary maker. Now, this is the one introduction, one pair of slides for an introduction. Now we have another comparison. This is the Does anybody know? This is the Diamond Sutra on Mount Tai, on Taishan, engraved in the rock. And these characters are about 50 centimeters high, and this is the largest engraving of a sutra in China, engraving under the open sky. It is about 1,800 characters on about 2,000 square meters. Now, the Diamond Sutra is one of the great texts, religious texts in Buddhism and actually in the world. And the idea is that diamond is the Buddha's teaching, which is so incisive and sharp that it cuts through all the illusions. And one of the main themes is there is the dualism of emptiness and form, but in the final analysis, this also falls into one. So it's a very philosophical and religious text, but I don't want to say more because we have one of the world's experts on the Diamond Sutra sitting here, so I better be quiet. But what I want to do is to point out that here we also have the engraved sutra, but here and here and here and here we have now what I now call colophons, which are secondary writings written later, after the sutra was finished. And here, in this case, they also have been added in the course of many centuries. The Diamond Sutra here does not have a date, but we think it was maybe done around 580 AD, and the colophons go up to the 20th century. And I want to compare this one to this here. Here we have the part of the Diamond Sutra, and this is a calligraphy scroll in the Princeton University Art Museum, and it's attributed or a copy by the greatest of all calligraphers, Wang Xizhi. And these are just his two lines here by him, and all the rest is colophons. All the rest is written later, starting from here and here and here, and goes on still. So, I should say these changes, these later changes, which were added here on the original paper, and then all this, they are hard to undo. I mean, you could, of course, cut it off, but you don't do that. And so that means whenever afterwards, after Wang Xizhi's, after the Tang Dynasty, or whenever today somebody looks at this piece, he cannot but look at all the colophons and take in the history of the piece, which is put down in these colophons. Now, these are just two appetizers, so to speak, to begin two juxtapositions. And now I want to show a particular example and show the relation between primary work and colophon. Here, we have a handful of iris bulbs, and there are 4 or 5 primary flowers shoot up, and they have not yet come to full bloom. And this brushwork is rather dry and seemingly haphazard, perhaps, but if you look longer, it's really deliberately placed. Just a few dots here, even those are deliberately done or done with intention. And all this reveals the hand of a master painter. A master painter. This is not something I can do. Or you, maybe among you, there are people who can do it, but normal people cannot do this easily. But we don't know. We don't know anything about this painting. There is no colophon to tell us. There is no colophon to tell us. Then, fortunately, at some later point in time, somebody wrote a colophon after the painting had left the hand of the creator, and perhaps even after his death. And this man who wrote this colophon identifies the artist. He says it's Pan Tianshou, who was born in 1897, died 1971. And in this colophon also he names the owner of the painting, a certain Zhu Yingren, and he identifies himself in the end as Zhou Changgu. And then in this brief text he assesses the aesthetic quality of the painting, and he places it squarely into the huge, mighty artistic tradition which goes all the way back to the awesome bronze vessels of antiquity. So his colophon reads, you can see it here, Master Pan Tianshou, Pan Tianshou's ink drops, as the power of his brush can lift a bronze tripod. I mean, they're so forceful, they can lift a bronze tripod of antiquity. And then he says, it was treasured and collected by my senior classmate, Zhu Yingren, written by Zhou Changgu. Now, then later, still another colophon was added by Pan Tianshou's wife. And she writes here on the right side, here, she writes, this is an unfinished work by Pan Tianshou. Comrade Zhu Yingren treasured and safeguarded it after all and held onto it as a keepsake, inscribed by He Yin. Now, He Yin was Pan Tianshou's wife, and with her authority of being Pan Tianshou's wife, she confirms the authenticity of the small painting, and she also confirms what the first colophon writer has said about it. So she gives her seal of approval. Now, the relationship between these two colophons and the paintings, the original painting, is complex. First, there is a spatial relation. After the colophons have been inserted into the space of the original work, this little square paper, no one will ever be able to view the painting again as it was, in the state it was when it left the hand of the painter. And then there is a symbiosis of material and technique. I mean, like the painter, the colophon writer applies ink, or they both apply ink on paper with a brush, and from this identity of material and technique, in this case at least, follows also an aesthetic union. I mean, this colophon writer, Zhou Changgu, writes in a very similar way as this painter paints the flowers. I mean, even the thickness of the strokes is comparable. And if we wouldn't know, I think if we wouldn't know, we could think that, that the calligraphy and the painting are by the same hand. At first glance, it looks, you agree, don't you? Yeah, could be. But it is not, of course. So the second colophon here by Pan Tianshou's wife is aesthetically not so much connected to the original work. She's a bit shy almost. I mean, this is modestly placed further away from the flowers into the upper right corner, and the calligraphy is sort of restrained and unassertive. Now I show you another sketch. This is another sketch by Pan Tianshou, again with the two colophons by the same colophon writers, here and here. And in this case, the original painting and the colophons are even more entangled. And if I had asked my student helper, as he did in the other case, to to get out the colophons, he might have had big difficulty doing this. It's almost impossible to take the colophon out without damaging the painting. So let us go back to the first sketch. Here, I talked about the relation between colophon and primary work, but there is more to say about this. The colophons open a social dimension for this painting. As long as the unsigned painting had no colophons, we didn't know its author, we didn't know its date, we didn't know its history, its place in society, nothing. Just we didn't know anything about it. But the colophons establish all this. And in particular, they define the social relation between four individuals. The first writer of the colophon, the first colophon writer here, Zhou Changgu, identifies the painter. He says this is Pan Tianshou. And Zhou Changgu in 1948 began to study with Pan Tianshou in the Hangzhou Art Academy, where after his graduation he became a teacher himself. And then the other guy who's mentioned, Zhou Yingren, was born in 1930, whom Zhou Changgu politely calls his older classmate. He also taught there from 1952 at the academy. And He Yin, also another former student of Pan Tianshou, married her master, Pan Tianshou, in 1930. So all three people who are named here are united in their admiration for their teacher. And one could say that the colophon draws even us, the viewers, into this relationship. As we ponder the biographical and almost personal information given in these colophons and alluded to in these colophons, we feel, each of us may feel as being accepted as a fifth member into this coterie around this master. And finally, there is also, as so often, a political dimension, and as so often it is not stated clearly. But these three persons named in the colophons must all have had painful memories of Pan Tianshou's lot during the Cultural Revolution, which was pretty awful. And this was an additional reason for them to join together in valuing his sketch. So, in summing up, we may just say that the colophons forge a symbiosis, a unity with the painting, which is spatial, material, technical, aesthetic, historical, personal, and political. Now, this was the introduction. Now we go into the matter, colophons in China. Colophons in China. And we look a bit briefly at the history of colophons in China. Now, among the earliest colophons in China are those which Buddhist monks wrote on sutra scrolls. I should say, if some student among you is looking for a thesis topic, that's a nice topic. The development of colophons on Buddhist scrolls or in China. I don't think there's a systematic study yet. Well, anyway, so these Buddhist monks wrote on sutra scrolls, and I'm just showing one of them. I'm not going into detail in this case. This is the sutra, how the Bodhisattva descended from Tushita heaven into the Heavenly Mother's womb in Chionin Monastery in Kyoto. And these Buddhist scrolls, we have the same symbiosis of space. I mean, this is the colophon, beginning at Datung Shilionian, and this is the text. It's the same space, the same techniques, the same stylistic even and aesthetic correspondence between primary and secondary writing, which we saw before. And so this colophon starts with the date, which is 555, and then 2 years, for 2 years, a certain Tao Wuhu here, he had the support of 30 individuals, and who made donations to him, and this happened in the monastery Tao Lan Si, and he collected and recorded sutras from across the entire country, and then he wrote this scroll. So generally speaking, this colophon here talks about this particular scroll, this specimen here. And generally speaking, I have the idea, but I'm not sure yet, but maybe you can enlighten me on this point. There seem to be 2 kinds of colophons in Buddhist scrolls. One in the end, this here, like this one, it talks about this particular object. And then there is a colophon in the beginning. In the beginning, I just take any random example. This is from Japan, dated 815. And this is a colophon here, up to here, so to speak, which talks about the text. It does not talk about this particular piece, but about the text, listing its title mainly, and the translator, possibly the author, and the time of the translation. So this perhaps represents or corresponds to the Chinese term Ti-ba, which means modern Chinese colophon, and Ti is the title writing, and Ba is the tail at the beginning. And maybe this is this dichotomy here between colophon talking about the text and colophon talking about the scroll. But the person who is going to write the thesis about colophons can investigate this problem. Now, after the Buddhist scrolls, we just look at 2 examples of secular scrolls. Secular scrolls, colophons on secular scrolls are much shorter and not so elaborate as those on Buddhist scrolls. And this is, most of you will know this, is a Feng Yutier letter about presenting oranges in the National Palace Museum in Taipei, again written by this most famous of all Chinese calligraphers, Wang Xizhi, 303 to 361. And as we know, original handwritings by Wang Xizhi no longer exist, but what we have are tracing copies. The earliest example specimens we have are tracing copies of the Tang Dynasty, and this is one of such a tracing copy. And part of the tracing copy is this colophon here at the end, Kai Huang Shibanian, which starts with a date, and the date is 598, and then follow the name of 3 palace connoisseurs, and they authenticate with their signatures. They authenticate the piece, that this piece is actually by Wang Xizhi. And interesting, the last one is a Buddhist monk. So Buddhist monks were experts in calligraphy, or in manuscripts in general. And again, if we look at this as it looks now, this is what we just saw here, these colophons, and all this was added in the course of the centuries. And again, we have this symbiosis between primary and secondary writing, and the primary writing, the 2 lines by Wang Xizhi are almost dwarfed by all the colophons, and it is hard to convince any viewer that only these are the lines of a genius and not so much worse than the rest. It's hard to say. And I'll show another second example of a secular calligraphy also with colophons, and this is, we saw before briefly, this is the scroll in the Princeton University Art Museum, which I showed at the beginning, comparing it to Mount Tai. This called Xingrantie, also a letter of 2 columns called, the prayer for ritual harvest. It's for a ritual good harvest is the translation. It's also a tracing copy, Tang Dynasty tracing copy, and this is the only early tracing copy of a Wang Xizhi piece outside East Asia. Now, again, it has many colophons, as we just saw in the very beginning. For example, here on the right is a colophon by the Qianlong Emperor, and he quotes a famous praise of Wang Xiche's calligraphy made by another emperor already in the 6th century, saying, "A dragon leaping at heaven's gate, a tiger crouching beneath Phoenix pavilion." And then in 1748, he added another longer colophon, and then he impressed, I think, 19 seals on this part of the work. And the earliest, but there had been earlier seals before. This is the earliest seal by Huizong, reigned 1100 to 1126. Now, these colophons again form an intricate symbiosis with the original columns. Again, there's a spatial symbiosis. The paper strip with the colophons have been glued onto the original letter here and here. And the seals, some seals are even covering the seam between these paper strips. So if you wanted to undo all this and have the letters in their original state, you would have to destroy to do a lot of destruction. So it almost cannot be done to bring the original work back into the state when it left the hand of the master. And then, in addition to this physical symbiosis of material and technique, there is a physical symbiosis and also an aesthetic symbiosis. I mean, Qianlong's writing here, it was a ghost writer, but anyway, this man, how he applies the ink is very similar to this ink. I mean, the thickness, the density of the ink, and even the type of script. I mean, Xingqiu is quite similar. So there is this aesthetic symbiosis. And then, of course, there is a historical symbiosis. While only looking at these two lines, like in the case of Pantianzhou, we wouldn't know what it is, what it means. But when we have all the colophons, then they tell us everything we want to know about Wang Xiche, or we don't want to know. But, I mean, people tell us. Now, these Chinese scrolls, which we have seen so far, these 4 scrolls, 4 examples, they were all hand scrolls. I mean, now the last ones. Dongqitang was, of course, a hanging scroll. But the hand scroll is maybe the foremost format in Chinese painting and calligraphy, and it lends itself particularly to colophons, because colophons can be appended endlessly, and you can even write longer, more and more and more. You don't even have to write on the mounting as Qianlong had to do in the hanging scroll of Dongqitang. And even before a scroll is rolled up to the point where you see the real work, I mean the primary work, you have to go through all kinds of information here. And you read all things, because of course you are an educated looker. I mean, you know what you see and you read what you see. And this gives you a frame of mind, because before you even have seen the first line of the original work, you are already conditioned somehow. Your mind is conditioned in some way. And just to show you another example, this most famous Chinese painting in Europe, Nushatento by Gu Kaichi in the British Museum. Gu Kaichi died 409. It is the same thing. Even before you come here, you have to read this, and then this in seals, and this, and then you see the painting. And then after the painting, it goes on. You have another little sketch, and you have a colophon, and you have another colophon, and you still another sketch. It's a commentary, kind of commentary, painted commentary on this painting. So you cannot really look at this scroll without taking all this into into your mind, and there is, I'm not going to detail what it means and so on, but there is, of course, a political dimension. Much of it was done by the Qianlong Emperor, and it says, I'm here in the 18th century, and I present this to you, and you have to look at it with my eyes. Okay, this was China. Now we go to, we look at some colophones in the West. And we start by colophones in the Middle Ages. I just... Here we have an introductory leaf to a medieval codex, one of countless examples, of course. And this codex has the title Libri Quattuor Sentientiarium, was written by Peter Lombardus, who died in 1160, and his 4 books are a systematic theological compendium often quoted in the Middle Ages. And this copy dates from the late 13th century, now in Merton College in Oxford. So you have the main text arranged here in 2 big columns in the middle, and with this wonderful initial. And later, readers have scribbled notes at the side, and in between the lines, interlinear notes, and at the side and below, and so. And probably not only one reader, but several readers. And what they write in these notes are probably notes for their own purpose. When they read the thing again, then they remember what they had thought before in studying the main text, and maybe also they want to pass on their insights and their information to later users. But these colophon writers did not really strive to achieve a coherent layout of the page. I mean, this is rather haphazardly added. And here another moving picture, actually very moving, Chronica Major, produced sometime between 1250 and 1259, shows the English historiographer Matthew Paris writing a colophon here. He writes a colophon to his own chronicle in the moment as he is about to die. So in China, the practice of writing colophons continued after the Middle Ages. And we saw the painting by Dong Qichang with the many colophons of the 18th century. But in Europe, the situation changed dramatically. And it changed in the Renaissance, in particular with the rise of easel painting. And then easel painting means paintings on wood and painted with colors on oil, as we saw this prime example here at the beginning. Now, in this particular case, that's an exception. There is some writing beneath the painting here. And this writing was done by a distinguished calligrapher called Johann Neudorfer, the Elder, who was a contemporary of Dürer. And it's quotations from the Bible in the German translation, which just had been completed by Martin Luther. And Dürer asked him to write this. But this is not a colophon. I mean, it is an integral part of the work. And it was devised from the beginning to be there by Dürer and Neudorfer. And it's also not placed on the surface of the painting. And in no way could this be taken as an invitation to add more colophons on the painting. So this is sort of in a pivotal work in this sense. It still continues the medieval tradition that you write on paintings, but it's already the beginning of the Renaissance scheme where you don't really add as an afterthought or as a later viewer on the painting. It is there's just this pivot here. And that you cannot add colophons, this is true until today. Nobody can write on a painting by Picasso. Nobody would dare to do this, or Beuys, or even a manuscript by Kafka. And so there are several reasons for this integrity of the work of art. The work of art must not be changed any longer. And what are the reasons for this integrity, which begins in the Renaissance period? I mean, there are several reasons, of course. One is the social status of the artist. He was now regarded a genius, or he had the quality of a genius, and he enjoyed a special degree of autonomy. And his creations were understood as perfect, and they could not be improved upon. There was no room left for interference by others. Another reason is the art market. The art market, the buyer wanted to be sure that the work he was purchasing was totally a creation of that particular esteemed master, had not been changed by anybody later or things added. And then, of course, I think the integrity of a work of art which precludes any change was a divine quality. Divine quality. It is one of the definitions of God himself that he will remain unchanged from eternity to eternity. And humans who experience, we experience constant change as the basic condition of being in this world. I mean, as the Greek philosopher Heraclitus said, "Pantarei," everything flows. So we long for something which will not change throughout time, and that could be a work of art. Now, this Western concept of the integrity of an artwork has fundamental consequences for viewing, for the act of viewing. In a Western museum, the viewer is directly confronted with the art here. Here the four disciples. And this has this viewer is left alone with the work of art. I mean, he's in front of the work of art. There's nothing between him and the work of art which might smoothen or mitigate this confrontation. For example, this young man here, who listens so attentively to what his girlfriend explains to him about Monet's water lilies, he cannot find any confirmation of what he hears on the painting itself. There's nothing written on the painting itself. And the lady, of course, it would never occur to her that she should get out a pen and write her ideas on the painting. And even if Monet's grandson would still be alive, even if he would still be alive, and if he would remember the day when his grandfather painted this particular water lilies in such and such a day, and there was such and such an event, he would not be asked to write this on the painting. I mean, they wouldn't ask him, even if he knew something which only he knows, he would not be allowed to write on the painting. And if the director of the Cleveland Museum would start to write his insights on the painting, he would lose his job on that very day. Now, another example, this Dali, this young lady here, looks baffled. Doesn't she look a bit baffled? What to think about the Endurance Memory by Salvador Dali, died in 1989. It looks as if she doesn't quite know what to make of the painting. I'm sorry. There is no colophone. There is no colophone to tell her what to think. And even this label here is very terse, and it cannot be seen in the same moment as she sees the painting. So she is left alone with the painting. It is an object. This painting is an object in the sense, in the literal Latin sense of the word. It is thrown at her, objected against her, like the Chinese 对象. It's put at her, and there is nothing between the object and you. But, of course, commentaries exist also for that writing. And the lady could use or look in a book, and like this monograph on Dali. And inside she would find all kinds of information which on a Chinese painting she would find in the colophones, such as particulars about the biography of the artist, the history of his work, its present collection of the work, or its stylistic and iconographic features, and so on, and also about its aesthetic merits. And in such a catalogue of Dali's works, Our Lady might even find a page with a facsimile of pronouncements made by Dali himself. And if Dali had been Chinese, he had written this as a colophon on his painting, but Western artists just don't do this. So Dali's colophon, as it were, and the discussions by others about this painting are spatially completely disconnected from the primary work. They come in a different material and technique with the printed book, and there is no aesthetic symbiosis at all between painting and commentary. But now to come back to China, in China we have, as we saw, not the idea of the autonomous work of art, at least not until the 20th century, under Western influence. But in China we have the colophones, but that does not preclude that we can also read books about this particular painting. Like here, the reader can check the colophones and commentaries information, but he can also read a book, like in the West. He can, for example, look here at this comprehensive discussion of Dong Zhichang in the catalogue of 1982 by Kohara Hironobu. And if he opens this, he will find photograph and commentary of the original of the painting, and he will find a transcription, and as it goes on, he will also find comments on the comments on the colophones, so to speak. And these commentaries on the commentaries, they add another layer of intellectual complexity to the work. So by comparison with a Western painting, the act of viewing a Chinese painting and appreciating its various facets, is to a higher degree than in the West self-referential and sophisticated. So now we have looked at all these colophones in general, and now we come to the Taishan colophones, but maybe we should take a break here and have question and answers. Please, if you have, yes. Please.
I'm not an art historian, but I wonder if the distinction that I sometimes read, you may say that the distinction doesn't matter, but the distinction between professional art in China and literati,
yeah,
whether this is really relevant here, because these were, at least its origins, as I imagine it, is these were done by literati not for sale, but as gifts to circulate among friends and so on.
Yes.
So that the whole, in a way, there's a kind of funny category shift going on, because it's not art or professional art the way we imagine it. And therefore, it's much more natural, at least in the original context, for people to write stuff on, when their friend gave them this piece of art, it's natural, you write stuff on it and then maybe give it to somebody else.
Yes, definitely. I mean, the social context is very important for this type of colophone primary and secondary work symbiosis. That's certainly true. That's certainly true. But I mean, of course, we have also colophones written on works of professional artists. That also happens. But the whole situation in China is different in this way. That's true.
you talk, I mean, wouldn't also have something to do with the prestige of calligraphy affect it? I mean, anybody in the West who would scribble on a painting, it would be defacing, but calligraphy is sufficiently prestigious and artistic in and of itself that it's not quite the act of defacing.
That's a very, very important point too. I mean, the calligraphy, as I try to show, this symbiosis between the original work and the secondary additions, the calligraphy, there is an aesthetic symbiosis and, of course, of technique and material, and the status, high status of calligraphy. But I mean, one could have imagined, but it wasn't done, that people like Neudorfer, who was a famous calligrapher at his time, would have been asked to write on somebody like Neudorfer, a century later or 2 centuries later, there were also famous calligraphers in the West. They could have been asked to write on but it didn't happen. But this is something between those colophon writers. There is a kind of dialogue over the centuries. I mean, if somebody has written something in the, let's say in the Song dynasty, then somebody comes in the Yuan dynasty, and he may quote him, or he may allude to him, or he may outdo him. And he wants to, I mean, there is a kind of dialogue, and he may write closer to the original work, and there is a competition in space, who gets close to Wang Xizhi. I mean, Qianlong writes his stamp right on the characters itself. So there is a game going on there, and this, of course, has to do with the high status of calligraphy. Yes?
And would it have something to do with the way that the Chinese language, how it conveys the message in the past? Like, for example, like if you look at the Asian Chinese language itself, like every 5 letters in a row, and then they have only 20 modern Chinese letters, but the message, if you translate it into modern Chinese, that would be over 200 words or 300 words in there.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, the language is, of course, lends itself to these very precise and terse colophons. Like I showed the first colophon, you remember, to Pantianshou by Zhou Changgu. It's amazingly condensed, just a few characters, but it's amazing in content.
I think it's very condensed, but also in the meantime, because it's condensed and it's only a few words, it also leaves enough space for you to fill in your own imagination and your own thoughts.
Yes.
In how to
Yes, but it directs your thoughts in a certain direction. If for example, if he compares this modest sketch by Pantianshou with the bronze tripods of antiquity 3,000 years ago, this is something which is weird. I mean, there is no connection. He constructs a tradition by alluding to these bronze tripods. Nobody would think of the bronze tripods when he sees those bulbs, iris bulbs. He constructs a tradition, a mighty tradition of Chinese aesthetic history, let's say. And this, you have to take this in as a viewer. You read this and you can say, well, I mean, this is nonsense. But first of all, you have to read it. And you think maybe he's right.
Well, it isn't just a visual reference, because of course lifting tripods was the old weightlifting competition, and the King of Qin, who was trying to do it, gave himself a hernia and died, and so on.
It's this
lifting tripods.
lifting. Yeah. Yes, the whole the strength. Yeah, the whole story behind it, lifting the tripod, and I mean the brush strokes are so strong as lifting the tripod, and. Once you have read this once, you cannot forget it. Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned that Qianlong Emperor may have used a ghostwriter
Yeah.
to do the calligraphy. Was this common for people to have somebody else?
I think it must have been very common. I think there were many ghostwriters. Yeah. Sorry.
So East and West, we live differently, we think different. The East and West is not easy to compare because Western society main subject of artists is either God or God-related objects. But in East, I'm not Chinese, I'm Korean, but our way of thinking and living is quite different from West. So it's not easy to understand, quite different. We evolve differently, we think differently.
Obviously.
So of course, when you go to math, it's all either God or God related, and you wouldn't dare to touch. But ours is different. So
Yeah, it had, I mean, the deep.
we have to interpret these things different angle and different way.
Yes, it's definitely basic differences between East and West, and the divine quality, so-called divine quality, that's one aspect. And of course, in the modern time, the Western concept of the integrity of art has taken root in China. I mean, even in Korea, if you don't write colophones on Korean paintings. Yeah, but not today. Not today. Yeah. So that is the Western concept of the autonomy of integrity of the artwork. It has taken root in East Asia, also in Korea.
And the other thing is that Emperor Gyeongbok, he goes everywhere. Not only Emperor Gyeongbok in Qing dynasty, he wrote his opinion to everywhere. Even porcelain, he put his opinion in the bottom of the porcelain and then baked again. So it's I don't know, it's good or bad, but
Yeah, I mean, Qianlong is an extreme example. I agree, it's an extreme example. But I mean, I could, yeah. Well, whatever. Yeah. But I mean, others do it too. I just use it to make the point. Yes.
In your remarkably generative comparison between East and West, Occident and Orient, in terms of colophon production, I'm curious where you see these traditions emerging in the digital age. Here we are at Stanford in Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
And whether you see people taking Monet's painting and adding a Monet colophon or their own, or are you seeing this somewhat prescribed yet open-ended tradition of colophon generation emerging in interesting and new ways?
Yeah, that is a very interesting question. And of course that can be done, or it is done, and artists also use former artists' painting and manipulate them digitally, put their own things, and so. And it has a parallel. I just listened by chance, like authors. I mean, who wrote this famous? What is the famous book? The English woman writer wrote the 5 volumes about this. What's in the fate? Huh? No, today the most. What's his name? Also made a movie and all this. Is this little boy who.
Harry Potter.
Huh?
J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter?
Harry Potter, yeah. Harry Potter, I'm sorry. Harry Potter. I mean, there are people who start writing Harry Potter new novels, or they take in the middle and they say this was not a good ending, and they write and they put it on the web. Yeah, I mean, this is possible in the digital technology, so it really changes our...
Jane Austen, too.
Jane Austen, yes. The new Jane Austen, yes. Yes?
Yeah, I was just curious. The Chinese painting has a lot of blank space, so people maybe tend to write in here.
Yes.
But the Monet, I don't think you can write anything on top of that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, but this is not the main reason. I mean, was water lilies a light color. I mean, if you want it with red color, you can easily write into this. And the empty space in the Chinese painting was not necessarily meant for colophon writers to write in it. I mean, it's part of the composition. I mean, the colophon writers they were happy to find this, but the painter, Nizan or whatever, paints his painting and he leaves the sky empty. He does not think later there will be a colophon writer. I give him a chance to write. I don't think they yes? Yes?
So you didn't mention this directly, but you talked about it over and over again, the fact that the calligraphy in the colophons mirrors this brush style by paintings. And,
Yeah.
you know, the obvious point, again, in comparison with Europe, is that it's a different painting technique, right? Obviously, we're using the same brushes, the same ink.
Yeah, yeah.
And so it lends itself to
Yes.
this overlap.
Yes.
And so my question about that is, if people keep adding colophons, do you think the calligraphy in the subsequent later colophons is conscious of the calligraphy style that they've seen before? And they're also perhaps adjusting their own calligraphy to somehow respond, not only the content, but the style of writing?
Yeah.
And also be a response to not only the painting, but the calligraphy that they've seen.
Yes, yes. In more often than not. I mean, it's not always, but often they do, and they try to forge an empathy with the original work in the style of calligraphy. In the style of calligraphy.
So as this goes on and new colophons are added, and then we may have an evolution in the calligraphy thinking
Yeah, yeah.
in reference to this particular artwork, right?
Definitely.
Part of the artistic experience.
It's exactly. So it's multi-layered, and when you look at these hand scrolls, after the third colophon, you think, well, he writes in a style like the first colophon writer, or something like this, and you go back, and the format of the hand scroll lends itself. You can go back and forth, unrolling it or uprolling it, other than a piece of music. And yeah, you can think about it. Oh, yeah, did he? I mean, so there are these, as I said, there's kind of dialogue between the centuries almost. Of course, it goes in one direction only, but there is this kind, exactly. Yes?
I'm just thinking, like, in terms of the structure of the character itself, because their English is more pronunciation. Because when you
Right.
write and you kind of know how to read it, but there's very little meaning. Well, unless you're talking about the roots of the word. But
Yeah,
it's just
right.
The language
Right.
itself that may not have the exact meaning of certain things, versus the Chinese language is it's more picture, more visual.
Yes.
The way that it delivers. So I'm just trying to picture when I paint an oil painting, because I'm Chinese, but I would not sign in Chinese on my oil painting, versus when I draw Chinese, like bamboo or something, then it actually goes well when I sign my Chinese label.
Yes. This is this enormous power of this calligraphy system in China. I mean, it almost demands that you, on a painting, that you write in Chinese characters and not in if it's a Chinese painting in Guohua. I mean, you don't write your name, Xu Beihong, or you don't write
Yeah,
in.
I put my Chinese name in Chinese letter on it, versus I wouldn't say like Francesca, that's my name.
Yeah.
I won't put Francesca
No.
with the Chinese bamboo.
No, exactly. It doesn't really fit. Yeah. Yes. I'm sorry.
When they create replicas of calligraphic work or painting in traditional China, do they copy the earlier colophons as well?
Normally they do. I mean, it depends on the price. If you buy a high-priced replica done in Japan, for example, they have all the colophons. But I have also seen, for example, Kukaichi's scroll in London. They only reproduce the paintings, and this is, of course, not correct. One has to have the entire thing.
The seals as well.
Everything, yes. I mean, but the modern and high technology reproductions do all this. I mean, it depends on it should be done, let's say, it should be done. Yeah.
It was done in traditional China as well.
Pardon?
Was it done in tradition, like pre-modern China as well?
Oh, in pre-modern China, well, I mean, one thing which can be compared are calligraphy cuts into stone. I mean, like, since the Ming Dynasty or even before, I mean, they had these compendia of famous calligraphy works cut into stone and then reproduced as rubbings. And there they also reproduced the seals and the colophon in the stone or in the wood. Yeah.
You mount a fairly wide definition of colophon.
Yeah.
I wonder if you'd like to say a few words about prefaces as well.
Yes. I mean, in the case of the scrolls, the Buddhist scrolls, I said there is a kind of preface or Tiba, the T, which is about the text. But prefaces on hand scrolls like Kukaichi, in this case it's not Kukaichi, it doesn't have a preface, but it could have one. I mean, there are scrolls where the owners or whoever writes a preface to the scroll. That happens. But that brings me to a point which I also wanted to make as an addition. You know, what I said today or so far applies also to books. And I just happened to buy a book day before yesterday in the bookshop here in Stanford Bookshop, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. I bought it. And then if you open this book, it says, on the first page, it says, "A Scandal in Bohemia." And the first sentence says, "To Sherlock Holmes, she is always the woman. I have seldom heard him mention her under any other name." And then you read the whole book, and the last sentence says, "And she is now the head of a private school at Walsall, where I believe that she has met with considerable success." That's all. Nobody tells you when was this book written. Nobody tells you who is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Why did he write this book? You don't know. I mean, they throw this book at you, and you have to read it, and you enjoy it. You make your own thoughts. No preface, no afterword. And I mean, of course, there are Western books which have prefaces, but I mean, this is a good example that in the West they leave you alone with this work. And this is another book, my book, which you so kindly mentioned, about 10,000 Things. And it was translated into Chinese, and it is very different from the English edition. It has a wonderful, or not wonderful, but it has a preface. I never asked this man to write a preface. He wrote unsolicited, I don't know him even. He wrote a preface and puts my book into a certain context, which I'm not necessarily happy with. And then there's a guy who wrote it long afterwards, even after the index, it starts. A Tiba. He writes a Tiba, and it's about, 15 pages. And he puts this book into a certain context, which I was amazed to read. But I'm just saying this is another example of what I showed you with these paintings, with the books. Normal good Chinese books, they have more than 5 prefaces. You have to have prefaces by famous people. And they put your book into a certain context. And then if the reader opens this, he says, "Oh, he is this guy, this general or whatever, also appreciated this book." So, in the West, we don't do this. Okay, I'm sorry.
Take a 20-minute break and there's some refreshments outside. Thank you for the first part.
Thank you.
Just begin whenever you're ready.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming back. Now we come to the second main part, which are the colophons on Taishan, on Mount Tai. And I had prepared some material which at one point I thought to distribute as a, to everybody, but it turned out to be so much that it's not possible to, it also includes a lot of pictures. So I put it on a hard disk, and I will give this to you, to now or whatever, and ask the center to put it on available, to make it available. So anybody of you who wants to look at this material can then do it afterwards. And it contains the colophons, I don't know how many, just a selection of colophons on Mount Tai. And they are altogether around 50, and people keep discovering new colophons. It's really embarrassing almost. And we have one collaborator, Mr. Zhou Ying, who is a researcher in the Taishan Yanyus War or something, and he has spent 30 years walking over Taishan and looking at all those inscriptions. And in 2009, we published an article in the journal Kaogu on the colophons which we had identified by then. And it was maybe the first time that somebody looked at a site through the colophons, not only the sutra, but what do the colophons tell us about the site, the development of the site, or the reception of the site. What did people think about the sutra in the course of the centuries? So we published this article in Kaogu, and then a couple of years later, or sometime later, this colleague Zhou Ying wrote to us, and he said, "This is a great article, and I've never thought of doing this, and it's wonderful, but you missed some colophons." And so we thought, this is the man we have to invite. And so we invited him to Heidelberg, and he worked with us, and he indeed had discovered more colophons, and also had thought about colophons which we had known, but he had new thoughts. And so this is some of the colophons you can only see at night with a strong flashlight on the ground. It's hard to, otherwise you wouldn't find them. But anyway, we have now about 50 colophons, 10 more colophons. And we are working on them and put them in the volume 4 in our series. Shandong section will have 5 volumes, and the 4th volume will be only Mount Tai and the colophons. Now, thank you. That's good. Thank you. I will just show you, I cannot show you 50 colophons, it's too much, and I'll show you just a selection today. So what we have here is the map, and the triangles show, the sites where there are these inscriptions. There's a cluster here, there's a cluster here, and it goes down to here. I showed this day before yesterday. And where is Tai? I'm sorry, here's Mount Tai, north of Tai'an here. And you all know Mount Tai, it has, so to speak, a southern facade. And you go up here very fast, up to 1,500 meters, the highest mountain in Shandong. And of course, Taishan is the most religious mountain in all of China. And the Buddhists were not the first to write on Mount Tai. I mean, Qin Shi Huang and Han Wudi supposed to have been writing, but very soon there were not many inscriptions yet when they wrote this Diamond Sutra, which I showed. And this was a big achievement, apparently, to be able to write on the southern side here of Mount Tai, not somewhere here. This is an earlier site, a Buddhist site, somewhere hidden in the north. But when they could write on the facade, I mean, this was really something they made it to be able to do this, and then such a huge site. Now, you see the Taishan is a very difficult mountain, rugged slopes, and in there somewhere they discovered, I mean the Buddhists saw this Jingxi Yu, this stone sutra valley. And there around 580 they engraved that sutra. We don't know exactly when it happened because the colophon is gone. There is no colophon from that time, but there probably was a colophon, but it has been erased, eroded by the water. But probably there must have been a colophon. Now, this is the site, and you see, I'll talk about this later also, you see this big problem is the water coming down here. There's a water, and it comes in as a waterfall, came down here over this little edge, and then flows down, and the sutra is engraved here. Here you see a few characters. This is all the sutra, but you cannot see very much, and much of it has unfortunately disappeared, and unfortunately these big dams have been done in the 1960s. And the idea was to have the water not come down over the sutra, but flow here and then flow on the left. So the sutra would be not covered by the water. But unfortunately, this worked almost, had the opposite effect, because the water is leaking. I mean, the water comes through here, and so it doesn't come in a big rush, but just seeping through, and then it gets all these black stuff here. So, and also, I don't know about whether this is really true, but as long as the water was running over the rock, the temperature on the rock was not so volatile between summer and winter. And now it's very hot in summer and very cold in winter, and many of the characters sort of come off, and it's probably not good for the characters. But anyway, this is something I will talk about later again, and just show you some of these lines coming down here, actually like water running over the rock. And this red coloring is recent. They have to renew the coloring every few decades or whatever. But there's good reason to assume that in the beginning it was also red. It was red, and one of the reasons to assume this is that excavated figures, excavated material from the time of the Six Dynasties, we have statues, and they have inscriptions, and these inscriptions are also heightened in red. So at the time, there was a custom to have these characters done in red, and so we assume that in these big characters under the open sky, the same was done. And you see them here, it's just fantastic, how they come down, these characters. And one of these, you see this character, for example, here, Luo, it is carved over the rock step. There is a klein small step in the rock, and it's carved into this granite rock. Now, we have been working on this sutra, and we are very fortunate that we were allowed to do this and go onto the sutra field and measure every character and record every character with my group here. And we also worked at night. It's the same thing as I mentioned before. Many things you can see better at night. If you have a strong light from the side here, you see things which you don't really see very well in the daytime. And here is Mr. Leife. He was a great expert on Shandong calligraphy and stone engravings. And he, with chalk, he draws the strokes as he sees them. And we have put these chords here, in order to see where the columns came down. And this is also something which has not been done before, I think. I mean, you have to do this. You have to put these chords over the rock to find to identify the columns. Now, here we have, of course, we do all kinds of measurements and we make plans and so on. And this is one of the plans which we did, and this has all the colophones. This is the sutra field here. This is the pond and the wall, which I showed, and here the wall. And the numbers here are all colophones. And the sutra field is number 1, and then comes here colophone number 2, and then colophone number 3, and so on. And basically the colophones are in 4 areas. One is the access road, which comes here, and which is probably, it's new. In the Ming Dynasty, it came over here, it came down here, the axis here. And then we have here a group of colophones in the west and the group of colophones in the north. This is this little waterfall, which I showed just before. And then there's a group of colophones in the east. So we have colophones on all sides. And I'll just show a few of them. I start with this colophone number 2, which is the first colophone after the sutra had been engraved. It has a date, 1117. And this is on a piece of rock. This rock, you can see, it has been severed from its original surroundings and recently with the machines, and has been put here. So the colophone has not the original location, and this was done in the 1960s when they built these dams, but there is no record where it was. We don't know where the colophone was originally, but anyway, it's at least preserved. Several other colophones have disappeared in this operation of building the dams. And now let's look at this colophone here. Here you can see the text, and here he says, Chengo Rei to you from Puyang. As I was surveying the school in Fengao district, looked at the valley with the stone sutra, I gazed intensely into the brush strokes. That means he was an official, and he was in the educational surveillance business. And he says the characters have a diameter of more than 1 foot, which is true. I mean, 50 centimeters. And then he says, this is not something man can do. So there is some supernatural quality. And then for thousands and hundreds of years, they have not been rubbed off and decayed. He does not talk about the Buddhist text. He just says these characters are large. And then he says something which is beyond the capability of men, but he doesn't say exactly what he means. But yeah, here then it says there must be a spiritual being, Shen Wu, to guard and protect and holding on to this in order to hand it down. So he's talking about the transmission or the tradition, but it's just a spiritual being. That's all he can say. He brings himself to say. I mean, it's amazing. This is, as I said in the beginning, I mean, one of the great texts of religious texts of humankind. I mean, the Diamond Sutra, and he doesn't mince a word about it. He just says this, that it's nice, the characters are large, and there has been some being, but it's to hand down to onlookers. I mean, it's also, this is not the function of that sutra. So there is this secular mind of the Sung dynasty, typical for this 1117. And then comes the name of the carver and the title. So this is rather unique colophon in this time, and then for a long time there's nothing. I mean, before that we don't have a colophon, or we don't know any. Between 580 and 1117 there's nothing, and then again for about 400 years there is no other colophon. But then in the end of the Ming Dynasty there come a lot of colophons, and they follow each other in very quick succession. And I will talk about several of them. And then in the Qing Dynasty, again, not much happens. But then in the Minguo period, we have again several writers who come forward. Now, we talk about the 17 years between 567 and 579. 562 and 579. And there's this colophon 3, and we have then 6, and so they start here. And these colophons now, I mean, we already saw in the colophon 1117 that this is not necessarily laudatory. I mean, it's not critical, but it doesn't really do justice to the religious potency of this engraving, of the sutra engraving. And now this is even less so in these colophons. They by far not at all affirmative or laudatory, but some colophons are even hostile of the sutra. Now, the first man to write a colophon is a man called Yuan Hongyu, who was born in 1516, died 1589, and he writes this colophon. He held the position of assistant education intendant in Shandong, and often we have people who were involved in the education in the province, and he writes a 4-character epigram, which you can see here, and another spectacle of ancestor Dai Zong Yu, what was it? Yu Sheng. Here, you see these enormous, huge characters. Even the first character, Dai, here is 119 centimeters high. I mean, high like that. I mean, more than double the height of the average Diamond Sutra characters, which, as I said, are 50 centimeters, which is already very high, very large in Shandong. They are the largest in Shandong sutra writings, but this is then double. And he writes in these colossal characters in a rather slightly fluent, regular script, and this is typical for this period. I mean, many people write in this way. So when he introduced this style into the Sutra Stone Valley, he introduced something visually completely new, and it was also modern, self-assured, these big characters, and not at all necessarily Buddhist. I mean, the Buddhists also use this, but this is not really Buddhist. And of course, ancestor Dai is an ancient appellation, Daizong, an ancient appellation of Taishan on Mount Tai, pre-Buddhist. So Then, in the same year, 1562, followed an elaborate statement about the non-Buddhist tradition on this rock here, on top of this rock. This is the field with the sutra characters and many effaced. Unfortunately, here they are still there. But somebody wrote here on top of this rock. And I think we don't know the author, but this is the scene from above. And he talks about the Neo-Confucian, or the Confucian tradition of writing. And he starts from the Shangshu, and I mean pre-Buddhist time, and then he goes down to quotes all Neo-Confucian writers, and he comes down to Zhu Xi. So it's a galaxy of luminaries which he evokes, obviously intended to demonstrate that there is a lengthy and powerful indigenous Chinese tradition that predates Buddhism. Then there is another engraving of which is gone. It doesn't exist any longer, but it was here, somewhere here. We know about it from records of the Kangxi era, and it was a chapter of the Da Xue, of the Confucian core text, the Great Learning. And this guy, this engraver, obviously intended this to be a rival to the Diamond Sutra. It doesn't rival the sutra in size, and length even. I mean, the Da Xue, which was here somewhere, is much shorter, but still it rivals the sutra, the Buddhist sutra, in ideological weight. Okay, and then in 1572, 10 years after the colophons had been resumed in 1562, there came a man called Wan Gong. He is the left vice minister of the Ministry of War, born 1515, and he was a towering figure at the time and the most influential among all colophon writers at the Valley. He left 5 colophons, and he began with an epigram of 3 colossal characters. Oh yeah, you can even see them here. And again, colossal characters, huge characters, and it reads Pu Jing Shi, and the first character Pu is 190 centimeters high like this, and carved very deeply. And I show you another view, maybe easier to see. Pu Jing Shi, and there are holes here in the ground, and I hope that they did not cut into the sutra text, which ran down here. Now we cannot see the sutra text, it has gone at this part. But probably he did not violate the sutra text, but it was very close to the sutra text. And Pu Jing Shi is still a Buddhist association, Sutra Basking Rock. It refers to an episode when the great pilgrim Xuanzang, when he traveled back from India, and once the sutras which he carried fell into the water, and then he took them out again and dried them in the sun on a rock. And so this is the idea that these sutras the engraved sutras look like the sutras which Xuanzang brought from India and dried them on the rock. So that's still a very nice association, and it occurs in Xiuji, actually. This story occurs in Xiuji, and that was not so much earlier than this year. So there may even be a connection here with the Xiuji, the journey to the west. I mean, now, then in the 10th month of the same year, 1576, Wan Gong wrote these 2 characters, Shui Lian, sort of water curtain, and this is on this little waterfall which we saw before. And again, huge characters, and he was the first one to write on this under this waterfall, and later people then wrote to the left and right, and they wrote an entire row of inscriptions here. And then Van Gogh also, I mean, Shui Lian Waterfall is one of the first colophons which alludes to the beauty of the scenery. That's also very indicative or very interesting change. I mean, they don't talk about the sutra, not religious, but about the scenery, and you rise your emotions towards the beauty of the site, sort of aestheticization of religious feelings. Well, then in the same year, Van Gogh made a major addition, and he built a pavilion. And this pavilion is here, and it was moved away from here in this revamping of the site in the 1960s. But this photo is from 1937, and one of our tools in reconstructing the site and understanding the site is using old photos. And there are quite a number of old photos, Japanese also, but Chinese. And here, for example, you see the staircase. And the staircase is one indication that the path towards the site came from here over the hill and then down. And then the people can sit here in the pavilion and look at the sutra. But very interesting is that Van Gogh writes in a long inscription here, which he writes behind the pavilion, "Please, dear visitors, come and sit in my pavilion and enjoy the scenery." But when you sit in this pavilion, you cannot read the sutra. The sutra runs down from here, so you see it obliquely. You see at the side, and it's very hard to read. I mean, in order to read the sutra, you would have to stand here, and then you can see the columns. But Van Gogh almost forces you, I mean, or at least guides you to a spot where you cannot see the sutra, and this has to do with what I said in the first hour, that they are these colophon writers who guide your thoughts. And they not force you. Of course, you can still go here. I'm sorry, you can still go down here. But normally, you led to this spot, and then you get another view of the sutra. You're not supposed to read it. And then in this pavilion, Van Gogh, the pavilion has now been moved from here to another spot, and is still there. And in this pavilion, Van Gogh wrote this here: Gaoshan Liu Shui to Ting, the pavilion of Gaoshan, of the lofty mountain and the flowing water. And this is an allusion to a piece of the zither, an ancient piece of the pre-Buddhist piece of the zither, Gaoshan Liu Shui. Many of you may know this famous piece, and nothing to do with Buddhism, before Buddhist, so to speak. And he writes this, calls his pavilion this way, and he, in his long inscription, he says himself that he came when sort of celebrate the erection of the pavilion, and he sat down with his entourage, and he himself strummed the zither and played this piece, and everybody was happy. And just in passing, this says Yuan Tou Huo Shui, the lively water from the wellspring or from the well. This is a quotation from Zhu Xi, and Zhu Xi uses these 4 characters in one of his poems, and it means you have to always go back to the sources, and then to the classic sources as he understands them, and then you have the lively water. And I mean, this is one of the fascinating and difficult but really rewarding things which we do. We try to identify these quotations. And here, of course, there is a battle between the Juxi and the Wang Yangming faction. And they playing this out among other places here in this pavilion. So it's really fascinating how the different layers of meaning here. Well, then this is this long inscription of Wan Gong, which I mentioned, and he calls it Gaoshan Liu Shui, and then he talks about how he built the pavilion and so on. There is a Festschrift for Wen Fong, appeared 5 years ago or something, and I have an article about this inscription. I mean, those of you who want to read this, or in the translation, I talk about this. Well, in this inscription, I mean, the Wan Gong invites the people the visitors to sit in his pavilion. And the pavilion was originally here. It was here. This is the staircase which is broken, but the pavilion was here. And when the people followed his advice and sat in this pavilion, as I say, they could not read the sutra, but then they looked on the other side, across the sutra field, and the pavilion was here, and the people looked over here, and there they saw the 2 characters, Jing Zheng, scripture corrected. This was quite visible. The sutra is hard to read from the pavilion, but this is very visible. And this is here also giant characters, and these fill this vertical rock from top to bottom. And it's a quotation from Mengzi, as he says here. Mengzi says, and Mengzi says, he says, what does he say? The gentleman simply returns to the standard, Jing. And if the standard is correct, then the multitudinous people will be invigorated here. And this is a play of words. There's three meanings of the word Jing. Jing, of course, in Sutra Stone Valley should be sutra. But here he uses Jing in the sense of Confucian classic, the Jing, like we have seen in the Great Learning. But in the Mengzi quotation, it is still another meaning. It means standard. If the people adhere to the standard, then they will be invigorated. So he changes the meaning of the Jing, of the sutra, of the term sutra, into the Confucian mode. I mean, it's amazingly brave to do this. Anyway, so these characters are the ones which you see when you're in the pavilion. You don't read the sutra, but you see these 2 characters when you do this. So I'm not going to talk about all the other colophons in these 17 years, but just to sum up 5 major changes that were made in this period to this valley or to the sutra. Stylistically, noteworthy is the introduction of these colossal characters. I mean, these powerful examples of modern script at the time. They exert a belittling, almost patronizing visual effect on the original sutra. Then there's remarkable is that the secondary writings, these colophons, now encircle the sutra. I mean, we saw here 3 and 6 also, and 4, and then here was the Daxue, and some of these starts some inscriptions on this little waterfall, and here was the pavilion and Wangong's inscription. So on 3 sides, they encircle the sutra. And again, we have the same phenomenon as we saw in the first part of my lecture, that it cannot be undone. What the colophons do to the visitor and to the eye of the visitor, he has to take in. He cannot look at the sutra as it was in its pristine form. He has to. And especially when he sits here in the pavilion, he will look here to the Zhengjing, to the Mengzi quotation. I mean, it's like a pincer movement between this pavilion and this large characters, and they embrace or they strangle the sutra. And this is, I think, comparable to what we see with the colophons in the hand scrolls. And then, ideologically speaking, in these 17 years, these texts which are here engraved, I mean, the colophons, they are no longer Buddhist in content or intent, but rather present excerpts from the Confucian classics and flout its values. And they hark back to ancient pre-Buddhist tradition, and they are put forward as a rivaling alternative to the Buddhist teachings. And the 4th point, then new genres of texts are introduced. Before we had only the sutra. Now we have new genre and epigraphs and poems. And of course, epigraphs and poems were not unknown in Buddhism, but these 2 genres have a proud history of non-Buddhist applications. And so they diminish the status of the sutra as the unique text form at the side. And finally, many colophons now alert the reader to the unusual, beautiful scenery. And this new perspective on the site, on the beauty of the site, further dilutes its numinous and religious aura. And this replacement, I mentioned already, replacement of religious with aesthetic values is a common phenomenon which we call secularization. Then, the next phase of engraving colophons began in 1588, a few years after Li Bangzhen, and it lasted through 1642. That is the year of the last dated colophon of the Ming Dynasty, and some 21 colophons were engraved in this period. Again, I will only mention a few. As this decline of the dynasty, colophon writers did not bring novel impulses. They took up the themes of the preceding generations and placed their engravings next to existing ones. And 3 clusters can be identified, which I mentioned already here, in the west, in the north, and then also here on the access road. And Wangong's pavilion was the rallying point, so to speak. Behind, I show the cliff behind we saw this already, behind the pavilion, and there are 7 extant Ming Dynasty colophons here and here. They were placed to the right and left, so to speak, north and south of the big Wangong inscription. And there is this there's this deep crevice here, which is also alluded to, and here we have, here you see this, at this point here is a colophon hardly visible. There's a rubbing is made, and then we took this rubbing, and then on the, I'm not going to talk about the content, but here on the right of this rubbing, of this here, is an interesting colophon because it's in Caoshu, in draft script, and it's a poem. It says scripture basking rock and water curtain, so it takes up Wangong's earlier epigraph. That's also rare to have a Taoshu engraved on rock. And this is one aspect of the literarization of this whole process. I mean, it becomes a creation of the literati class. And here then we have the southern cliff with this crevice here, and you see here some characters which are not in red, and here another one, and here also something. So there is a, oh yeah, this was probably the first one, testing the sword stone. It sort of cut through the stone. It's testing the sword stone. And then this was the first here, the first inscription, and then we were sitting here and trying to measure. You can see roughly the height. And then we need a ladder to go up here. To a ladder. Even then we cannot reach up here, and even to go further up, we need another ladder. And here, this is the character Shui. I mean, this is this character Shui here, Shui Shi. And you see beneath the character is another inscription, Da Ming Wan Li something. And this happens sometimes that earlier inscriptions are overwritten by later inscriptions. And this man writes, water and rock shrouded in darkness. Here, this is this inscription, water and rock shrouded in darkness. And then he has a long colophon with date and name, and he also cuts into this earlier inscription. And this man we know, Chen Yangyan, he was a regional inspector of Shandong at the time, and he destroyed these two earlier inscriptions. And in this, he destroyed two characters. Shen Qu is left, but this was destroyed by him. And this is one of the things we have to do to find out what was destroyed. And here it is Gu Qin. You can imagine Gu Qin here, Shen Qu. So sometimes we can resurrect the destroyed characters. I mean, this means, of course, a profound taste for strumming the zither. It's again the zither. I'm not going into the details why this man destroyed the others and what his intention was or so, but that's another tricky problem. And now then we have another, this row of inscription which I showed already, which started here with Shui Lian by Wan Gong, and then other epigraphs are added in the course of time. And just showing this one again, this Qian character destroyed the signature of this earlier epigraph. So they are quite ruthless. I mean, it's amazing. They destroy the earlier inscriptions, and I don't know what they think about this, but they do it. And this is interesting also for the reason that here you see a little hole, and there was a seal in that hole, a seal made of ceramic or clay or something, and this it was the seal of the writer. And so the whole thing, this seal likens this plaque to a writing on paper or wood, perhaps. It's a format of the literati here again. I mean, so what we see here is also literarization of the site. And just under This is another here, 4-character epigraph, pillowing on the stream and southing on the rock. Unidentified man, we don't quite know who he is, but he also destroyed, he wrote over another writing which you can hardly see, you can actually not see. But when we tried to make a rubbing, or our good Chinese colleagues helped us to make a rubbing. Here you have the characters, and the rubbing is done. And then in the rubbing, here are the characters, the large characters, but behind or beneath the large characters are small characters. And it's one of the fun things to reconstruct the original inscription, which we can do to a large extent. Now, a few more colophons were placed in this time, and some colophons are also lost, and they are only known in literature. That's also another aspect of our work, that we go through the epigraphic literature, and find old records about colophons which have disappeared in the meantime. But if we look at, then if we look at this, what happens to the end of the Ming Dynasty, the framing of the original sutra, the encasement became all the tighter, all the more tight. And these later colophons in the last decades of the Ming Dynasty, they now emphatically direct the emotions of the reader to the aesthetic values of the scenery. Now, this outburst of engravings, colophons, commentaries at the end of the Ming Dynasty, 37 colophons in 80 years, this suddenly came to an end, and hardly any dated colophon is, only one dated colophon is found in the entire period between 1642 and 1929. And this is another epigraph here, the pure sound of Brahmanic hymns, engraved in 1857 in the heyday of the of the Taiping rebellion. And we are one of our students trying to measure, and while she measured, there came the wind and all her leaves flew away. But this is a minor mishap. I mean, there are others. But even, although there were no more colophons, or hardly colophons written, the site was not fallen into oblivion. And I mentioned that, I think, the day before yesterday. Very famous is Kang Yu Wei's assessment of this, of the sutras. And he says that the characters on Mount Tai are the forefathers of calligraphy on tablets for buildings. I mean, the huge calligraphy. So people were quite aware of Tai, even if they didn't write or engrave colophons. But in the modern period, in the Minghua period, people again wrote colophons or engraved colophons. And then in this period, Minghua until today, the patriotic and national aspects gain prominence. And there is a colophon written in 1929 by a man called Yao Guangyu. He was a magistrate of Tai'an County. I think it's number 4 here, this one. And he accompanied Chiang Kai-shek on his ascent to the peak of Mount Tai in that year. Chiang Kai-shek is not on the photo, unfortunately. And I think that because Chiang Kai-shek went up there in 1924, Mao Zedong never went. So this man, Yao Guangyu, he writes a colophon here. And this is a very sober, you see, I mean, it's a real official, very sober, simple calligraphy. And he writes about the sutra state of preservation. And that was already very much on their minds at that time. And he says that he wants to redirect the flow of the water, as it was done later, as we saw. But he couldn't do it because he was sacked. I mean, many of these people after they had written colophon, disappeared. Many of them were really, their career came to an end, and often they were even killed. So it's terrible what happened to these people. Anyway, he wanted to do this, but he couldn't, and then now I'm coming to the last colophon today. This is by Guo Mo-ruo. And Guo Mo-ruo came here, I mean, you all know Guo Mo-ruo is the Minister of Culture under Mao Zedong, 1892 to 1978. And he wrote this poem here. And this is the first poem, as you enter the Sutra Valley today, is the first poem which you see. And you have to read it, or you would read it, and you cannot ignore it. I mean, this is again this thing what I'm saying, that he directs your thought. And before you have even seen the first character of the sutra. But very interestingly, Guo Mo-ruo takes up the first colophon writer whom we saw of 1117. And here is again this kind of conversation spanning centuries. I mean, the first colophon writer, you may remember, he had noted the characters have a diameter of more than 1 foot, and Guo Mo-ruo, even more poetically, says they are larger than a peck, And then the colophon writer had said, this is not something men can do, but Guo Mo-ruo, the sober historian, writes, written by a man of the Northern Qi dynasty. And then he does not speak of thousands of hundreds of years, as the man in the Sung dynasty guy had said, but he just says 1,000 years. And as good Marxist, Mao Zedong's Minister of Culture does not invoke a spiritual being to protect the site and prevent the characters from decay, but he writes triumphantly, in reverence, now we have come upon liberation, and these characters, they should not blur further. It's actually just a note. I mean, he says it's a character of the Northern Qi, right? It dates to the Northern Qi. And when he had been there, he came in 1961 or before, I think, he saw the character engraved on the sutra characters, and shi jie de shi, this little stroke down here is missing in the character or engraved characters. And Guo Mo-ruo said this is typical, this is a taboo character of Li Shimin, and the second Tang emperor, so it must be Tang dynasty. And then he went home and he checked his books, and then he saw that in Asatana, in Xinjiang, there was also this character Shi written in this way. And this was definitely pre-Tang. I mean, there's no doubt about it. So he revised his view, and he sent a new poem. I mean, he sent this line in the poem here. He had said maybe Tang Chao Ren So Shu or something. Then he changed it. It's now Bei Qi. And so it speaks for him. He was ready to learn. And he sent the new poem to the people in Taishan, on Taishan, and he said, please, I made a mistake. I'm now no more. Please use this poem now. But he talks about the preservation of the site, and rather than its religious significance. And he directs the thoughts of the visitor towards this issue of protection. And at the same time, and I don't know yet whether he was involved or there is a connection between his poem and this change which they did in the 1960s. They built these dams, which I showed in the beginning. I mean, Guo Mo-ruo's poem is it cannot be seen. It's somewhere here, and all these huge dams were built, and this whole thing, this bridge and the all this was added, quite brutal actually, and probably with an attitude of naivete maybe, or maybe also hubris. They added these dams, and now the lower end of the sutra here, the sutra comes down here, and this is the lower end, and this is obstructed by this artificial hill and all these buildings. And so these dams now encase the sutra on 4 sides. And this was the major, you see here, this is where the pavilion was. Here's the Wan Gung's inscription, here's the cleft in the rock, here the pavilion. But now they have these amazing dams, and this dam, and this whole thing is newly built. And so the sutra is really encased. And this, of course, was the second major change of the topography after the 16th century change, which Wan Gung had done with his pavilion. But compared to what was done in the 20th century, Wan Gung was still rather modest. But he was the first to change the topography. And now the water, which had come down for over 1,000 years here, is prevented from flowing down here, but it's meant to flow here. And as I said, I mean, some water is seeping through here. So we have this problem now with this site being really endangered, and let's see what do I have here. Yeah. Then I will end again with this juxtaposition, with which I started. I mean, these colophones here, they now forge this same symbiosis with the original sutra, because they are done in the same material, rock, in the same technique, chiseling and so on, and they cannot be removed. I have said this already several times, but still there are 2 crucial differences between the colophones on a hand scroll and the colophones here on the sutra stone. One difference is that the colophones on this hand scroll are not only, well, no, one difference, the one main difference is that, as I showed, the colophons which are engraved in the topography in the landscape, they not only direct the visitor's thoughts, but they direct his movements, where he has to go. He has to go to the pavilion, or has to go to this house of the sutra. So they even physically influence not only his thought, but also his movements. But in the second main difference between these colophones on hand scrolls like this one and the colophones here is that colophones on a painting or calligraphy are always laudatory. They don't say bad things. And the reason is, of course, that the owner is present when the colophon writer writes. I mean, when this man writes, the owner of the scroll is still alive, and he says, please write something for me. And so the writer will be very complimentary. He cannot say this is a fake or so. But in this case, in the Sutra Stone Valley, this does not belong to anybody. The Sutra Stone Valley does not belong to anybody, so the people are free to voice their critical opinion. And there may not have been monks for a long time. So this has become public domain. And we can then only hope that Gormo Raw's last line, where he says, now the characters should not blur further, that his wish will become true. Thank you very much.
few questions?
Of course, of course.
I don't have a first question to come. Just listening to the second part, it reminds me of graffiti. This is sophisticated graffiti.
Sure, graffiti.
It's an art. And it's a political, social.
Yeah. I mean, but the difference between graffiti and these colophons or these commentaries is that they are done with aesthetic ambition, and they are thought of, they are thought out. I mean, people, before they do these engravings, they think about it, and they make a sketch, or they, as I showed, I mean, there's lots of thought behind it, like Zhu Xi and Wang Yangming or so. But if a graffiti person, he just comes and writes something and leaves again.
Well, I've seen some very artistic and some very meaningful regarding protests against politicians or laws that are, so it's almost like, these are not famous people, but they are artists, and some of the font in the writing is actually very beautiful.
Very beautiful. Oh, you mean graffiti can be beautiful? Yeah.
Written in bridges, like how do they do this? How do they?
Yes.
I've seen some
Yes.
of that, especially.
Yes, but the difference, one other difference between graffiti and this takes quite effort to chisel this thing into the. On the bridge, you just use your brush and you do it and finish. But here, there's some work behind it. Yes.
And that means that they don't do the inscriptions themselves. Presumably, they have to engage a professional. Presumably.
Yeah, that's a very.
The whole economy in the area.
Yeah, that's a very. I mean, Gomoro didn't use a chisel. He's just sent the paper with ink, and this is one of the perennial problems which we face here. How far has the style changed? In some cases, we know that at that particular date, when there's a date, so and so wrote this in 6 months of whatever year, that this person was not there on that date. We know from his biography. So he sent this, and it was engraved by somebody, and even the spot may have been chosen not by him, by somebody who had the power to choose the spot. That's another very interesting issue. Where do they place these colophones? Yeah, so there are several layers of uncertainty. We don't have the sometimes or often we don't have the original handwriting. We only have the engraving, so we don't know how far they differ, the handwriting and the engraving, and sometimes we don't even we know that the engraving was not authorized by this particular engraver. So there's, much uncertainty. But I guess that's part of the game. I mean, yes.
Can you give an example of a specific criticism? You mentioned even hostility to the sutra itself. What a specific example of criticism?
About the Confucian. They say, I mean, the people engraved the Daxue, this core Confucian text, and then later commentators, or even I think he himself, he says, I have now overwhelmed the sutra. I mean, this is sort of better. And then there is many implied criticism when they say, I strum the zither, and this is much earlier than anything Buddhist here in this valley. So there's this implied criticism. Yeah?
Do we find similar descriptions of Confucian or Neo-Confucian messages in other mountains in China where they don't have?
Not so blatantly as I now. Yeah, that's a good question. We have Ming Dynasty colophons to these 6th century sutras on some of the mountains in Shandong, but they are not Confucian, and they emphasize the scenery. But in a certain sense, this is also diluting the religious potency of the original sutra. They just say, oh, isn't there a beautiful scenery here? But this using Confucian ideology and Confucian text in such a obvious way, that may be the only instance. It's very interesting. Yeah. But these guys, I mean, one of them, he was working in 1562. He must have been really, I mean, today we would say out of his mind. I mean, he decided to erase earlier imperial inscriptions on Taishan, on top of Taishan. I mean, there's Tang Xuanzong's inscription and Sung Zhenzong's inscription, and he erased one of the imperial inscriptions and wrote a Confucian dictum there. Amazing. Yeah, but he was one of those who got sacked and then couldn't continue. But they were quite ruthless in changing this received tradition. Yeah?
I'm just thinking to continue the discussion, I was thinking because for Confucian is more, it's that in my memory, usually the first emperor of the dynasty, usually they would tend to promote Taoism, which is kind of saying that we as people, as long as we try hard enough and we can change our destiny, that's the Chinese say, 人定胜天.
Yeah.
So versus when in the second or later on when they already established their political power, in later year of the dynasty, they would promote Confucianism, which would be saying that this is your destiny. So maybe you wanted to, listen to me and obedience, promote different culture. So when they have the people that digging out the previous inscription in there, are they trying to erase to promote to stop people from looking at the previous Taoism, which is to promoting people can change
Yeah, and there are two inscriptions which have Taoist associations. And there's one in the Sung Dynasty, and it says, abbot from so-and-so Taoist monastery, which we know, which was on Taishan, on the way up. And he came and he wrote a short inscription that he was there, but it not with ideological weight. And then there's one small other. This is the only Taoist elements in this Jingshi Yu. But we cannot observe that Confucianism was stronger in the beginning of the Ming Dynasty or in the beginning of the Qing Dynasty in later abated. This cannot be seen from the colophons.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was my
Yeah. No, not here. Yes?
Among the colophons that you did not introduce,
Yeah.
were there some that were expressing Buddhist piety?
Or praise.
Praise, yes. This one which I showed where it says the Brahman,
Pure sound.
pure sound, yeah. This can be understood in such a way. But this is one of rather rare, and not very explicit, but it is explicit. It is positive, of course, but it's rare, yeah. And what is also amazing, I feel, that there are not real commentaries as we know them from Buddhist texts. That some would, I mean, of course, they were dozens of commentaries to the Jingangjing written, and nobody quotes from them and says, here, this is how we have to understand the Jingang. So the tradition does not continue after the Tang Dynasty, it seems, at least here. Which interesting, yeah. But it may also have to do with the fact that there was no monastery. You know, there was not a monastery with monks who safeguarded this site. I think they had disappeared. We don't know. I mean, there is no engraved inscription of an abbot of a monastery. Yeah. Yes?
I'm wondering about the consumption of the scripture carved here.
Yeah.
Just based on the plans that the sort of site map you showed, before the construction of the dam, water's running over the entire scripture?
Yeah, it depends. Yes. It depends on the season. Okay. It's the season. But, no, what was this here? Yeah, in the summer, this is obviously a waterfall. It was a waterfall, and it can, maybe not, certainly not throughout the year, but in summer or so, the water comes down. And in some of these old photographs, you can still see the water coming down there. So the water came down then over the whole field, and depending on rain or much rain or not. And I guess there was even symbolic quality there. I'm not sure, but I imagine that the idea that the rock solid truth engraved in stone of the sutra and the floating, like ukiyo-e, I mean, the floating world of the water flowing over it, sort of ephemeral. Could be that this was also an idea.
So given that it's a stream bed,
yeah.
I'm wondering where you would actually stand so that you could read the scripture.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Because now there's a bridge at the bottom.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that the pavilion built there is built in a spot where you could...
from the side, yeah.
So for example, one of the first colophons there from 1117,
yes.
You mentioned it's curious that he doesn't...
We don't know where it was, but we don't know where it was located.
Oh, that's no longer extant.
No, the stone is extant, but the stone was removed from its original situation, severed taken away, and we don't know where it was originally.
But I guess what I'm wondering is the author of that colophon perhaps wouldn't have arrived at a time where he could have seen the scripture from a perspective that he could have read it, right?
Yeah, it is indeed probably before all these changes in the topography. There may not have been one spot where you can stand and see the entire thing because it's too large. It's possible, but certainly, or most probably, you could go to the southern rim and see most of it, but to read the characters which are on top of these columns, this may be 50 meters away, and it's also very hard.
So one last little question.
No.
I mean, that colophon is so much earlier than the other colophons.
Yeah.
Was this site like famous and well known during the Song? So did that guy arrive and say, oh yeah, this is the famous Diamond Sutra carved in the mountainside, or did he just say, oh wow, this is a really big text. I wonder what it is. I can't read it.
Probably he didn't know. Probably he didn't know that it was the Diamond Sutra. It's amazing. I mean, two answers to your questions. When we investigate those sites, we always try to check the epigraphic literature and find as whatever has been written about this site, we try to find it translated and understand it. But this starts mostly in the late 18th century. There are very few examples where we have an earlier record, but not in Taishan as far as I know now. Maybe we have to dig more, but we haven't really found old records of the Diamond Sutra. But I'm sorry, what was your question?
So, I mean, my basic question was, is there clear evidence that this site was known, famous for being a carving of the Diamond Sutra during the...
Yeah, and whether this man knew that it is a Diamond Sutra. Yeah, I suspect he didn't know. It is amazing. I mean, it's hard to believe, but even up to the year 2000 or so, even in the modern times, people who write about these, even contemporary scholars, not now any longer, but maybe until the 1980s, they didn't identify the texts. They just said, oh, must be Buddhist. So it's amazing. And like Ran Yuan, I mean, the great fountainhead of epigraphy in the 19th century, he says, yeah, there is a Buddhist text, and it has a colophon by such and such a person. They are very interested in the history. Says, oh, this title was only used in the Northern Qi dynasty, so it must date from the Northern Qi. They do things like this. But he doesn't say this is the Diamond Sutra or this comes from such and such a sutra. They don't. Amazing. Only actually the Japanese during the war. I mean, there were some Japanese coming doing research on these sites. And they are among, I mean, there were just one or two, but before, of course, Tokiwa and Sekino, they really started systematically to identify the texts. They hadn't been done before. And some texts were only identified, 10 years ago. I'm sorry, yeah, yes.
I'm just curious, back to Max's original question about how people saw it or couldn't see it. Is it possible that the original intention was separate from the aesthetic of the water being, temporary and the super is permanent, that since it's such a large scale, that maybe the original idea was when the water was not flowing, to walk up and down, and read it that way.
Yeah, that's certainly one good possibility. And there is between the number 9 or 8 column from the right, up from the beginning, and between the 8th and 9th column is an empty column. And there, people could have walked up there and just looked left and right. This also happens on Tieshan, on Mount Tie. There is an empty column between a group of 8 here on the right and on the. It is quite likely that people walked on this strip upwards. But then, yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, in Peru, they have the Nazca lines that can only be seen from very, very far up.
Yeah.
I'm still wondering, why were they made if at that time the Incas didn't have airplanes or... So sometimes these signs are for the gods, not made for humans.
Yeah, sure. They were, but still the Chinese are rather sober, and they want to read things. But we also have to consider the fact that the people who really know, they know them by heart anyway. They know the text by heart.
Just one more question.
Oh, we can have more. I have coffee. Yes, please.
In terms of the progression of Buddhism, the dissemination through Asia, was there any particular milestone in the 6th century where there was an expansion or something geographical about the whole dissemination of Buddhism that would have made, I mean, that was a pretty huge undertaking.
Yeah.
And there was no monastery.
Yeah. Well, there must have been monasteries at the time. We don't know. But you're quite right. It's amazing what they did in the Northern Qi dynasty. And we have records that there were 3 million monks and something like this. And the entire population, 10% of the population were clerics, monks and nuns. And that was one of the reasons why then the emperor of the Northern Zhou clamped down on them and had them go into military service and so on. I mean, but at this time, this was a heyday of the Buddhist establishment, and these engravings in stone is one thing, and the other which remains are these hundreds of sculptures which we have from that short period of the Northern Qi. Especially also in Shandong, where they have been excavated 10 years ago, in Qingzhou, or so 10 years ago. But this is only what remains because it's in stone. But what we read in the records, I mean, it was full of monasteries and all kinds of paraphernalia and a huge flourishing Buddhist culture at this particular time in the second half of the 6th century. Yeah.
Sorry, I can't speak loud.
Oh, you want a microphone?
No, if you can hear me, then that would be okay. I'm not convinced that the text was meant to be read. It's too large. Anyone who knows the Diamond Sutra in that tradition, it's easy to memorize. You see a few phrases, you recognize it's that sutra, you can recite it. What you presented 2 nights ago and in other writings is a network of sites in Shandong. In the same period, the same calligrapher, Prajnaparamita text. So my question to you is whether you and your team have an overarching theory about why this was being done at that time.
Maybe you can help us someday. I mean, this is really an exception because it's not Prajnaparamita text. And there must have been...
Diamond Sutra is Prajnaparamita.
Right. But I mean, not in such a... Yeah, it is. But I mean, not in such a specific, sort of condensed way as the others. But I mean, there must have been different groups of monks at work. For example, the Lankavatara Sutra on Mount Gang, it's done by other monks than the Prajnaparamita texts, and it's also different calligraphy. And we don't, of course, people have spent decades on who to identify the calligrapher of this sutra here, and there's no real result. Whether it's the same, some people have said Sangandao, but it's probably rather not him, but some people have others, and so unfortunately we don't know enough about the network, the social network of the monks and of the monasteries who were behind this. But as I say, there must have been more than one. It may have competed. There may have been competition.
Lothar, I think, could go on for a couple more hours. We only have the room until 4, so I think we have to conclude, but not before thanking him one more time.
Thank you. Thank you.